Hi, I'm Debbie Millman, and I host a podcast called Design Matters from the TED Audio Collective. Every episode, I have conversations with designers, writers, artists, and other luminaries of contemporary thought. People like Roman Mars, Ai Weiwei, Ethan Hawke, and Ashley Ford. Join us for an inquiry into the broader world of creative culture. Find and follow Design Matters with Debbie Millman wherever you're listening to this.
Looking at magic, not as an end in itself, but as a means, and looking at it as a technical medium for the expression of other ideas, in a similar way that there are a lot of things that can function as a functional craft or that can be art.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. One of the things I like about contemporary art is how flexible it is. I'm always learning new things because art spaces are always bringing new ways of making and thinking into the mix. Recently, unexpectedly, this has included magic. Specifically, I'm thinking here of Jeanette Andrews. Andrews began her career as a professional magician, but now works mainly in museums, creating a body of work that's something new, exploring magic as an expressive medium. Her works usually bring together the science of perception, the intrigue of coded messages, and the history of illusion as a craft. Andrews has performed parlor tricks dreamed up by an algorithm to investigate human versus machine creativity, reperformed the earliest documented magic trick from 1584, and made art inspired by the use of sleight of hand, actual CIA espionage in the 1950s. Her explorations of this unusual creative space are actually getting their first dedicated museum exhibition soon at the Elmhurst Art Museum in Illinois. That's a little bit of news we're breaking here on The Art Angle. As a matter of fact, you heard it here first. Earlier this month, I went to see one of Jeanette Andrews' most recent commissions in Boston at the MIT Center for Art, Science, and Technology, and I can only describe it as a hybrid of stage magic and social experiment. The questions of why, if, and how magic fits in the museum seem fascinating to me, so I was happy that Andrews agreed to talk about how she pulled off her biggest trick of all, making magic art. Jeanette, thank you for coming on the podcast. Talk to me about your work.
I am so excited and honored to be on.
Well, let's just get right into it. I'm bursting with questions for you, and you've done many projects that I want to introduce to the audience, but let's start with magic and then get into the art. How did you get into magic? How did you become a magician?
Yeah, so I got my start in magic in a fairly traditional way. When I was 4 years old, I saw a Siegfried and Roy TV special, and I just fell in love. And
the guys with the tigers.
Yeah, exactly. I know. Very different than where my style ended up going. But I looked at it and it was so visually arresting. And I saw it and I was like, that's what I'm going to do. Now, 365 days a year of my life for now 30 plus years. That's what I've done.
And you trained as a magician. I mean, this is one of the things that interests me about it as a creative subculture or as an art, that it is very craft-based. It's a craft.
Totally.
It's not an academic craft. There's like a culture of magicians where people learn what they do.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily a school. How does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of my favorite parts of it too, is like it is a super technical craft. And it's something that I feel like is one of few things left that still really largely functions in this borderline like apprenticeship kind of model and being circulated in this very, for better or worse, insular community and in print books. Magic is still a very like print medium based learning culture in terms of the actual like technical teaching of it and kind of the circulation of like technical manuals. So I studied as like a technically trained magician from when I was 4 or 5 years old and still rigorously doing that sort of technical training to this day, because that's a big part of what undergirds what I do.
It almost seems to function to me the way that art used to function and no longer does, where there are sort of masters and apprentices.
Totally.
And the lore is passed down that way.
That's dead on. And that's totally like, at least certainly within like not only the technical aspects of it, but then kind of like stylistically in the schools of thought and things like that, it is very similar in that way that a lot of times you can see a performer and say like, okay, this person stylistically kind of in terms of their mannerisms or their movements or their propensities, like very clearly, like in the community, we could see like, oh, this person came from this very like certain style of like this subculture of Spanish magicians, for example.
And before you crossed over into this new genre that you've created or are a part of, the museum magician, if we want to call it that, you were just a working magician for quite a while. Am I correct about that?
Totally correct. That was how I made my full-time living. And it was great but what ended up becoming basically like my kind of technical medium for the work that I make is something that's so reliant on understanding lived human behavior. And so having basically, kind of like cutting your teeth on a lot of kind of trial and error in live performance for decades is massively informative and important for people that do this type of performance.
I know that this is a passion of yours to reclaim the prestige of magic. There's an article that Katie White, my colleague, wrote about you a couple of years ago. And one of the things you say in that article is, in the 1800s, going to a magic performance held the same esteem as the ballet. What do you think changed?
A few things. Larger social things. So magic in the mid 1800s basically was something that essentially functioned for two audiences, which was basically like street performances. And then there was the birth of basically what we consider modern magic, which was born in Paris in the mid 1800s by a man named Robert Houdin. And that was something that was pretty exclusively for like the socially elite. And
so this is like, this is the modernist turn in magic. It's the mid 1800s. It's about the time of modern art.
Yes, exactly. So basically then it was like, the scale of it was small. It was things presented. It was a type of magic that was born known as parlor magic. So it was something that was performed for people literally in their parlors for small groups that would have these longer form pieces. Maybe a single piece of magic would take 10 to 20 minutes to unfold. And that was the audience it was designed for. And it was also typically in the mix with things in sort of salon culture of the time. Like these types of performances were presented sort of in the salon culture and in tandem with these things, like their kind of scientific demonstrations of the day and chamber music and things like that. So then basically the arc of the fall essentially was we then saw the birth of big spectacle stage magic, which was still very well respected, and it had a lot of narrative structure and a lot of high production value. It was, in large theaters that were designed explicitly for the performances and scenic design, and there'd be, a narrative that was kind of undergirding the whole thing. And then we saw the sort of fall of that type of performance and the rise of the moving image. And so then suddenly, that's when we start to see the idea of live performance in that type of vein start to be replaced in some ways. And then we also very quickly thereafter see the birth of vaudeville. So suddenly what you had was performers that were coming from the sort of mass populist performance of having full scale like sets and things that were like sometimes really on par with what today would be like a Broadway set design
like Siegfried and Roy,
lighting. Yeah, I mean, like suddenly now that was basically in a very quick span of time almost obsolete. And now in the span of vaudeville, people had to make these really intricate things that then were now their whole performance, because they were having to fit into a performance with other performers. They couldn't take 10 minutes to do, a single piece of magic. They had to have their entire act happen in that 10 minutes. So it lost a lot of the narrative quality and it lost a lot of the production value, because suddenly you couldn't really build it. Everything had to be able to be disassembled and thrown on a train car and reassembled and just skirted around. And so you see the aesthetic change a lot during that time period. Basically, then what happens is then there's like two more kind of interesting social turns where we see the Great Depression. This is essentially where we get the birth of the birthday party magician.
Interesting.
I didn't know this. And I find this fascinating because we see this in so many things in culture. And this is just one example of it. But like the thing that people associate with an entire industry, number one, is like relatively new compared to its long history and is like very niche. So basically, you had all these vaudeville magicians that had now already kind of had this stepwise progression of changing what they were doing. And, in the span of 30 years, we saw like the production value go down, the vaudeville stuff happen, then the Great Depression, everyone's out of work. And then it's like, where can we make any money? And so it's like any social thing that was still happening. So it's like people were still marginally celebrating birthdays, so people were like doing, birthday party performances. So that's then where we see things in the way that we do now, like slapstick comedy type of magic and magic that's associated with children, because magic was not a form that was really like explicitly designed for children in that way.
Well, and I think it's also in that time period that the reverse happens, that films go from being a kind of a carnival entertainment to really being for adults. And that's a big phenomenon. The Depression is the narrative film starting to dominate popular culture. And I guess this brings me back to what you do and reclaiming magic as an expressive medium and art form, because tell me if you think I'm off base, but one theory I have about this is that it's also about developments in media, that people are surrounded by images in a new way and thinking about what's real and what's not. And this comes up a lot in the texts around your magic in the museum, which is it's really thinking about misinformation. And then on the flip side, there's a sort of a question of like, whereas you can see almost anything in image form now, there is something about magic that happens in front of you. Its effect is inseparable from the fact that it's not mediated, that you're right there with the person.
I totally agree with that. And I think there was a minute, had probably, 15, 20 years ago when, video editing, everyone suddenly had iMovie and people were like, oh my gosh, is this going to make magic obsolete, kind of thing again. We ended up seeing, I think, speaking exactly to your point, we saw the opposite turn of like, as a great lover of phenomenological philosophy, like our embodied perception is so robust and so complex. We all understand this. Like we all understand that there is a very different lived experience of seeing something tangibly or intangibly unfold before you that you're viewing live with other people. There's a really interesting kind of social real-time fact-checking, basically, that's happening when you're watching something, quote-unquote, unbelievable happen live with other people. It's a very different cognitive experience.
Yeah. What was your aha moment when the art part clicked in, or you realized that you could do this in an art context? Did you find the art world, or did it find you?
I found it, because of being so perplexed, is like the front and back end that I was seeing so different. Learning about the history of this and how it used to be a much more culturally respected form. And then in my teens, I just got really into philosophy kind of by chance. Now my view on this changed a little bit, but the types of questions that philosophers were investigating through the lens of aesthetics and were really deeply interrogating through looking at painting and sculpture and later in dance and film were so central to a lot of the questions at the heart of magic. Now I'm really interested in sort of the epistemic and ontological questions that magic provides on top of the aesthetic ones. But to me, it was just like so painfully obvious that I was like, magic is this really rich medium to explore these really interesting philosophical questions that our whole lived experience. To me, it was just so painfully obvious. And I was like, why is no one doing this? And so basically that at about 15 became my life project, was trying to figure out not only how to recontextualize magic in terms of the sort of cultural regard that it used to have, but then how to also use it as an artistic medium to express ideas about our world.
So you're from Chicago, and some of the first versions of what you do now happened at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, correct?
Yeah.
Maybe even you started more as a magician there for their first Fridays. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So I was first asked to perform a very short 2-minute piece of magic for their first Friday back, I think it was in 2012, if I have my math right, 2010, 2012, somewhere right around there, I think 2012. That's how we first came into contact with each other.
That's almost more in the entertainer mode, but
Totally.
then you've sort of moved from that to do multiple projects for them. So
Yeah.
maybe describe some of those to give the audience a sense of where you went.
Yeah, so I was really lucky in that I ended up doing then 3 kind of pieces of work with them over the next probably 8 years, which was a presentation of a work that I developed during my first artist residency, which was called Thresholds, which again, this was very like time specific, but it was, and still very kind of in like entertainment mode, but they were gracious enough to still present it, that was basically magic for each of the 5 senses, kind of moving through 5 different spaces in the museum. And that was presented with a surrealism retrospective that was happening at the time. But later, a couple of years after that, was the museum's 50th anniversary, and they had commissioned me and several other Chicago-based artists to reflect or respond on several significant pieces that happened in the first couple of years of the museum. The piece I did was called Invisible Roses and was kind of meant to be in dialogue with the 1969 piece that Christo and Jean-Claude did at the MCA Chicago, which was one of their first large-scale building wraps.
Conceptual artists who wrap things, and they wrapped the whole building. So
Yeah,
it's a
in
very
cloth.
important work in art history that they were celebrating for their anniversary. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was that work?
As part of their anniversary, they had just undergone a bunch of building renovations. And so my performances were happening in a new space that no one had ever been in before. And they were a little worried about people navigating there. So I ended up designing a bunch of maps to help people get there, which I hand printed in invisible ink. And people basically entered the museum and it was like, hey, if you want to see the performances happening today, like here's a map for how to get there. And they would unfold the maps and they were blank. And then there was just a little note on the bottom that said locate roses. And then almost like in the basement lobby of the museum, we had brought in 1,200 live roses and participants were given one and they would brush the head of the rose across the paper and it would basically develop the invisible ink, which then was a map that led them to this newly renovated space where my performances were happening. And then once people got there, the performance piece I did was for people who've seen Christo and Jean-Claude's work. They have a very specific style of how they wrap things that is both kind of constrained and kind of messy and really unique and kind of, I don't know, I find it really gravitationally interesting. And so anyway, I had a large kind of pile of this wrapped fabric, would slowly unwind it, and there was a single rose in a bud vase. I would snap the head off the rose and crush all the petals and they'd fall to the floor. Invite 2 people up from the viewing audience, basically would stretch between them this about 20-foot length of fabric, and they would cut it in half, they would tie it back together, and then they would stretch it out between them again, and the entire piece of fabric was restored. And then we would turn and look back at the kind of headless rose, and the head of the rose has magically grown back.
Wow. So how does that environment change magic as a performance?
The thing I've been interested in is, as I've kind of evolved, looking at magic, and not as an end in itself, but as a means, and looking at it as a technical medium for the expression of other ideas, in a similar way that there are a lot of things that can function as a functional craft or that can be art. We see this a lot in textile and fiber art. We see this a lot in ceramics, like things like that, where, really cool mug here. This is a totally functional object. It is an end in itself. And then I've also seen amazing ceramic artists that are incredible. I see magic as a technical medium that's not dissimilar in that way. And so for me, a lot of it is looking at how to use magic, which does have very specific kind of features and functions, and how to use that and play with certain aspects of that or downplay other aspects of that, and how to have that basically act as like a small catalyst for the expression of the larger concept.
So do you view magic itself essentially as performance art, or is there something that has to be added to it in the museum context?
This is probably a hot take, but I don't inherently view it as a performance art. I think it default in our current social framing culture is entertainment
So
typically.
you want to push beyond that to add some kind of element that questions the way people perceive in the art space.
Totally, yeah.
Okay, so I feel like you're unique in this emphasis on perception. A lot of magicians are have a more occult aspect or interested in the occult. And you're more interested in science, right? And that's really, you've done research work around perception, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that I love. I think taking something where the complexity of it and the richness of it does have certain affordances, like looking at something like how do we perceive the world? To me, there's so much happening there because magic, from a technical standpoint, is so multidisciplinary that a lot of times kind of looking at essentially almost the scientific angle of this as a magician, just from a technique standpoint, you have to basically create a live, flawless simulation of reality that functions exactly as reality would, and yet also technically or mechanically works completely differently. And so to do that, you have to understand or try to understand what the kind of confines of reality are. Just for example, like the coffee mug I have here, if I need something to look like a coffee mug, but it has to do something else, it has to functionally do something else, I have to spend a lot of time thinking about exactly how I pick that up, what a weight distribution is around a handle, how it's going to tip a certain way. And these are the sorts of things that intuitive physics, explores a lot in terms of like early childhood development, how we look at basic understandings of how objects move in the world. And a lot of what from the back end goes into something like magic is these ideas of like the cognitive science piece of it, which is one of my great loves, these ideas of like the intuitive physics piece of it, the idea of there's a lot of math that's going into magic. There's a lot of object design. There's a lot of material science, which is another one of my loves. There's a lot of psychology, a lot of sociology, writing, all these things that I think are so ripe for like deep inquiry purely because of the fact that magic is functioning in such an anomalous way that is sort of where a lot of the richness, I think, for some of the scientific inquiry comes from.
I think the science piece also connects to the disinformation piece. I mean, they're
Mhm.
both connected to information sciences. And I wanted to ask you about one of the artworks that brought you to my attention at the Boca Raton Museum of Art a couple of years ago, where you worked with the CIA Manual of Trickery and Deception. I think that connects some of these aspects of the science and the craft and your interest in magic history. So tell me about that work, which I'm not even going to say the name because the name is Magician, but it's punctuated in a way to emphasize the fact that the word CIA is hidden in the word magician, correct?
I felt a little goofy about titling it that, but I was like, it's right here. I can't not do it. Um, The CIA had declassified a bunch of information in the late aughts. And I think it was in around 2008, maybe they had declassified some of this information under the budget of MK Ultra, which was a lot of when the CIA was looking at a lot of mind control and poisoning and things like that. They had hired one of New York's main prominent close-up sleight of hand magicians to write a manual to train spies for how to use sleight of hand in the field. So I read this when it came out, and it literally is beat for beat. Honestly, it's a lot of kind of things that people would learn as like a technical coin magician, but swapped out instead of like doing something with a quarter, it's a lot of things with poison pills. This was a lot of things that I had learned as a child growing up in magic that was like with this end of like entertainment and fun. And here was used for the ultimate nefarious ends. It was one of the most fascinating and bone chilling things I've ever read. And it stuck with me for, whatever, 15 years. And I'd been in dialogue with the curator for the show for a while, and she was really interested in learning the history of magic and asked me to recommend some books. And that one had escaped my memory. And I sat in her office, and all of a sudden I realized I was like, oh, I told you about the John Mulholland CIA book. And she was like, what's that? And I explained it. And she looked at me dead in the eye and just said, do that. So what I ended up making was this piece that it was only the second or third piece that had no live performance in it. So that was definitely an interesting challenge for me. It was one of the main commissions of a large group show that happened at the museum. So, it was the first time, or one of the first times, something lived without me for months. So the piece was basically this sort of kinetic book where I wrote, photographed, and handmade this book that was an homage to the CIA Manual of Trickery and Deception, where it was situated in almost like a clean room style, like clear acrylic box that you'd like put your hands in either side of the box. And this was for viewers and visitors to do. And so they would flip through the book, and essentially they'd flip through it, and it was a black and white magic book, like a magic technical manual explaining history and kind of considerations when you're designing a magic performance. And they'd close the book, and then they'd flip through the same book again. And then in their hands, the book transformed to this like bright red kind of spycraft manual that was images that then I had rendered the images in Morse code. And it was a whole bunch of other kind of information. So it was this book that would just transform as people read it. So that was one piece of it. And then the other piece of it was a film. It was my first longer short film that I ever made called The Attention. And it was all about how both the spycraft manual and the history of espionage, and as magicians, there's so much about the direction and manipulation of attention. And so the film depicts me as a very kind of abstracted magician performing a piece of magic that was very widely performed in bars in the 1950s, especially in the Chicago area where I'm from. It's like a very technical piece of close-up card magic. And then you sort of start to see about midway, the worlds kind of start to fracture, and you start to see everything kind of changes colors a little bit. And now you start to kind of get these inklings that maybe this person has some other background or intention, and kind of flip into almost this other character. Long story short, and I'll just give the spoiler of the piece, but basically the piece of magic is an unseen spectator signs a playing card that disappears and then reappears folded up in the foam head of their beer. And then you start to see me kind of beat for beat doing the same motions in the last split second of the work as you see the sort of almost spy character, you see something get dropped into a drink. So I was very interested in how the same gesture and sequences of movements, when we look at something like covert gestures, what the ends of that look like.
So do you almost think of yourself then, you go from magic as very trivial birthday party tricks to here magic as literally instrument of assassination or killing people.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me, based on this work and the one that I saw, you almost work within this other tradition of magic, which is kind of debunking magic or letting people see how the trick is done. Is that complex for you? Because tricking people in a way is the whole game.
I'll be very explicit in that I'm never revealing how the techniques of magic are working and what I'm doing. That's something that I still ethically hold very dear.
It's controversial within the field, right?
Very controversial. So obviously there's people like Penn and Teller that have sort of basically early on made a name for themselves by doing that. I think I'm kind of two minds on it, but I'm not revealing how things are done, partially because I think a lot of kind of these social and cognitive things that are happening are more interesting a lot of the times and are more relatable to people, honestly. But speaking to the point on the debunking tradition, in the sort of scientific anomalies of how magic works, there's just so much we can learn about attention and perception and social behavior and all of these things that I just love having conversations with people about.
So it's really more about having people pay attention to their own attention rather than revealing the exact mechanism, essentially.
Totally. Yeah. Especially in our current attention economy. I think that was a big part of what the film piece I did for the Boca Raton show, the subtitle was The Attention. And that was something that it's your attention is being constantly manipulated by who and for what ends. And, this was something I think we're all trying to think about.
Well, which brings us to your most recent thing, which is you've just come off this 2-year-long residency at MIT Center for Art, Science, and Technology. Tell me about that and what you did with that.
It has been the greatest honor of my life for me as somebody for now almost 2 decades who's been on this lifelong quest to try to, re-elevate and resituate magic. Getting nominated for this was, um, I was endlessly crying. I was so delighted and touched. But, I was brought into it because of sort of this attention and information piece that there's a great quote from the Edward Tufte Visualizing Explanations book. He was basically an early, almost like data visualization designer and designer generally. And there's a quote in one of his books where he says something to the effect of, magicians are ethical disinformation designers, which is not wrong. And
Must
so
have tickled your brain to read that. Yes.
yeah, I mean, that's the thing that I think is really interesting when we study this stuff is like, we know that magicians are going to deceive us. And as viewers, we consent to that, which is really a weird thing when you think about like, what other instance is there in life when you're like, deceive me, please? It's really weird.
Well, I guess maybe art.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think like these like perceptual things I think is really interesting. So basically, I was brought into this because of a already happening collaboration between Graham Jones, who's an anthropologist who studies how communities of magicians function, and then also how ideas of power and meaning function, kind of, and what magic can show about that. And he was working on a collaboration with Arvind Satyanarayan, who's the head of the data visualization department at MIT. And they were talking about basically the spread of so much mis and disinformation, namely surrounding COVID statistics and people pulling things from the CDC website and making very different interpretations. So the idea of like the interpretive lens for the same data points was their interest. And Graham was like, well, let's get a magician in here to talk to us. So originally I was brought on just to kind of have a conversation, given my background and research interests. And then they ended up asking me to do this larger artistic work, which was called The Attestation. And the piece itself was about how the cognitive science of belief polarization and how people can view the exact same piece of information or the same gesture or movement and have completely opposite interpretations of it as to whether it makes them trust or believe something more, or whether this split-second visual thing is the thing that ultimately piques their scrutiny.
I visited this performance and I'm still not sure exactly everything that happened because it's sort of about different groups of people going into the magic performance that you do are exposed to different information in advance. Totally. And then afterwards, you debrief with your colleagues and sort of realize that people basically perceived the magic or the act that you were doing in different ways. What did you learn from having multiple audiences go through that?
Yeah, I mean, like the whole thing that I was really interested in was sort of the idea of how grounded are we in a certain opinion or a certain belief, especially once you find out that people hold a contrary belief, I think is really interesting. So basically the mechanics of the piece, and one of the things I was most interested in, which this has a twist ending, I'm fine talking about it on this, to be honest, is the audience was secretly divided, unbeknownst to them, into 3 groups. I never perform in theaters, so because normally all the public work I do is in museums. And so working in a theater was honestly really a challenge, but ended up designing this space so that the entire kind of front proscenium of the theater, where traditionally a front curtain would be, was a wall of one-way mirror. And so an entire half of the audience was seated in the theater seats and could see onto the stage.
In a way, the most startling moment for me is when it was suddenly revealed to me that I had been on stage the whole time with the whole other audience watching me watch you.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear that you were startled by it because, the idea was basically kind of bifurcating the audience. There was this kind of secret group of hidden observers that I made a short film to kind of set up the premise, which was that, they were going to be secretly observing the other half of the audience, which would be seated on stage and watching this performance, that had no idea about this entire group of hidden observers. And the hidden observers were told that the people who were seated on stage were subdivided into 2 groups who would be exposed to learning different structures of cause and effect prior to the performance that would make them basically place trust and scrutiny in different moments of the performance. So, in a quick nutshell, what that looked like was each half of the onstage audience were told that they were invited to a VIP, like pre-performance reception, which was all fabricated. And each of those two groups, basically through really insidious kind of means, were taught that certain gestures always activated something. Like they were always causal. So like moving a round object to the center of a round space always activated something. So I made like a faux ticket scanner where the tickets that people had were round, and to like scan in, you had to move your round ticket to the center of this round ticket scanner. And that's when a light would activate. And so it was things like that. And people in that reception were invited to make tea. And there was an induction burner there where it was like, okay, we all know that, a tea kettle is only going to heat up if you put it in the center of the round, part of an induction burner. So it was all things where everyone in that group kind of learned anytime something moves to the center of a space, it always does something else. And the background of this is that in magic, there's a certain subcategory of something called convincers, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's convincing an audience of a base state of something so that something later that happens seems more impossible. If you think about a little kid showing you a magic trick and making something appear in their hand, they have to show you their hand empty. Like so often little kids will like walk up to you and they'll have a clenched fist and then open their hand and they're like, this piece of candy appeared. It's like, cool, well, your hand was closed the whole time. Like that didn't appear. So basically there's things like the one I was most interested for this performance, and then I'll get back to the larger point, is if a magician moves an object out of arm's reach, it's typically considered, we all understand that that's harder to act on. It's harder to manipulate with an object when it's out of your reach. So my idea was that typically like the default is that is a communicative tool used in magic performances to make something seem more impossible and sort of heighten the state of impossibility. As opposed to, I was like, what if that moment can have the opposite function? If people can watch the same moment in this one tiny split-second moment, that is the thing that in its default stance in the social frame of magic performances is the thing that is supposed to make something so much more impossible and impressive, is the thing that for this subset group is the thing that piques their scrutiny. And they have this sort of uncanny sense of like, something just happened. I don't know what, but something just happened. So the idea was basically these two onstage audiences were exposed to all these cause and effect structures where like, something moving to the center of a round surface always does something. So then in the performance, I had an object vanish where I had a dollar bill that was in a wine glass and I push it out of my reach, and it's in a cylindrical wine glass that moves to the center of a table. And so for the people that were in that group that learned like round object moves to center of round surface, does something, that should have piqued their, and it did pique their scrutiny, that something just happened. Some sort of invisible thing just happened, as opposed to the people that did not kind of have that prior belief that it heightened their belief. Basically, I was really interested in kind of the cognitive science of how learning different cause and effect structures impacts almost like a borderline narrative belief, and that seemed totally unrelated. And then conversely, how we speculate about how other people form these seemingly rational or irrational beliefs. And that was the purpose of the hidden audience, was they were told that people would have opposite beliefs about the same moments in the performance, but they were not told how many groups there were, and they were not told what the moments in the performance were that they had piqued scrutiny about. So I wanted them to just speculate wildly about what people had visual scrutiny about.
So how did magic in this performance function differently than people think it normally functions?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I was really interested in was trying to push on the edges of what magic as a performance does. And this was an hour and 20-minute piece, and there was 6 minutes of magic in it, which is very different than how people think about magic performances, where it's like trick, 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 back to back to back. And one of the most interesting pieces of feedback that I got was somebody who told me that they barely remembered there was any magic that happened. which is like the total antithesis of what every magician is typically striving for. They want an audience to remember exactly what they did and be able to recount it in like perfect detail for decades. And the piece of magic I worked on, was something that I spent a lot of time creating and is a really technical piece of magic. And the idea that it was purely just this like tiny seed kind of squarely in the middle of this that people borderline forgot happened, to me was really functionally interesting.
So magic as a social experiment or fascinating. We have to wrap it up. So Jeanette, thank you so much for talking to me today. I can keep talking for a while.
Oh, so could I. I appreciated this conversation so much. And I've been a fan of the podcast for such a long time. So it's been an honor to be on. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, please take a moment to rate and review our show. It helps other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili, with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. As always, thanks for listening, and see you next week.